Hey, gang. John Canter, the Double Broker Bounty Hunter here, and welcome to part two of our transportation fraud prevention series, double brokering types and variants. In our last part, we basically covered the evolution of double brokering, particularly the recent evolution. Double brokering's been going on forever, but let's face it, in the last few years, it has gotten exponentially worse. So we've talked a little bit about the background and the laws that cover double brokering and why it is illegal. So in this part, we're going to go over the types of double brokering and the variants that exist out there and help you try to identify them a little bit better. Before we do that, though, a word from our sponsor, AccuBid Pro.
What is your cost per mile? Have you been hitting your profit margins? Do you struggle with bidding in a way that is both profitable and competitive? Would it be worth it to have all of this information right in front of you? By calculating your cost per mile, AccuBid Pro helps you stay profitable in an industry still struggling to recover. In order to calculate your cost per mile, AccuBid Pro asks you questions about your business expenses. Our goal is to help you understand what you need to keep operating in order to keep up with the game and maintain your business. Enter your origin and destination, and we show you what you should bid based on your personal cost per mile in order to be profitable. Bid smarter, bid faster, bid better with AccuBid Pro.
With that being said, let's go ahead and get into the nuts and bolts about the different types and variants of double brokering that exist. One of the key things to keep in mind for everybody is that double brokering is really the first step to almost every scam that exists out there today. If we can stop double brokerage, then you can prevent almost all the other types of scams that exist out there, including cargo theft, cargo ransoming, et cetera, et cetera. So this becomes exceedingly important about knowing how to identify the different types of double broker scams and to be able to best understand how to react in those. And we'll get into all of that as we move through into future sections. In the meantime, let's just go ahead and talk about the different types of double brokering that exist. There are two main methods. One that I call skim off the top, or the traditional method, which does include an end game variant. We'll also hit on the most recent and what we typically see today, the too good to be true form. And lastly, impersonation, which is probably the most dangerous that these scammers have come up with so far. So, skimming off the top means the scammer is selling the load to the real carrier at a reduced rate versus the real rate. Again, I call this traditional double brokering, and it involves scammers who have real authorities. Again, this is a little bit back, a little bit dated. We typically saw this about 3 years ago. So you have a scammer who has a legitimate carrier authority. Granted, the truck is probably fake, the VIN number's from out of a scrap yard, but they actually have an authority. So with that authority, they go and they book a load with a real broker. So once they have the load from the real broker, they have a rate confirmation. Then they take that rate confirmation and they flip on and put their different hat on as a broker. They go to their broker authority and then post that load out on the load boards, DAT, truck stop, etc. And they put that out there usually for around 25 to 30% below the rate that they were getting. For an example, if the scammer booked a load with the real broker for $1,000, odds are when they turn around and sell the load as a broker to the real carrier is taking it for $700. This is how Most of these international double broker scammers have operated for several years within the transportation network without being noticed. At the end of the day, they paid the carrier what the carrier was promised. And as long as the carrier didn't get wise to the scam, then the scammer was able to continue doing the things that they do. That is very important. A lot of these brokers who were doing illegal brokerage, double brokering these loads, they had been operating for almost years. Once we got around 2021 and these patterns started to be obvious, then carriers calling out these scammers were able to then figure out who the real broker was, contact the real broker while the cargo is still in their truck, and then get the scammer cut out of the loop. Once the scammer was cut out of the loop, the real carrier was able to get the real rate for the load, therefore making that extra 25, 30% back more than they had originally planned. The good thing about this particular technique was that the load always got delivered to where it was supposed to go, and the only economic damage that was suffered was borne by the real carrier who didn't know they were losing money off of it. And that is how they have been able to stay undetected for so long. Once the industry got wise to what they were doing, then these fake brokers had a very limited life expectancy, usually less than a year. So the more often they would get caught doing this double brokering, the less likely they were able to continue to operate for an extended period of time. So then they had to start looking for additional authorities to leap to in order to continue the scam. Once they were about to shut down that authority, however, they would go into a phase that I call end game. And that end game phase, instead of the real carrier being paid a reduced rate, the real carrier would not get paid at all. And the rate that is offered to the real carrier is significantly higher than what the scammer was going to get from the real broker. Now, this would typically only happen right before the scammer shuts down the brokerage. That way, there's no recourse. There's no way to go back after the scammer for pulling off the scam, short of going after the scammer's bond. Of course, if the scammer's only got a $75,000 bond, and there are about $1 million worth of claims sitting out there, then that means that bond is only going to pay on those claims at pennies on the dollar. So that was a very hard lesson learned over the course of the last few years for many carriers and brokers alike. Now we have what's most commonly out there, the too good to be true scam, which basically is the scammer jumping to the end game. The scammer is selling the load that they booked with a real broker to a real carrier at an elevated rate versus the real rate. You will typically see this at about 30 to 50% more than the market rate for the lane. So it is absolutely critical, carriers, that you know what the market rate for that lane should be. If that rate exceeds, I say, 15 to 20% of the market rate, you need to be very leery about who you're doing business with and be prepared to call them out, because you could be caught up in the middle of the scam. So some of the impacts of the too good to be true scam is that scammers are paid in full, just like in the other one, but the scammer will then ghost the real carrier. The real carrier does not get paid at all. Unfortunately, the real carrier doesn't realize this until either their factoring company tells them it's a scam load, or if they invoice net 30, those 30 days go by and they still haven't gotten paid. And then they try to call that broker and no one's answering the phone. Another impact is the carrier is, as I said, is not paid at all and needs to then file a claim against the shipper for payment. And this is codified under 49 CFR 377. The consignor and the consignee are ultimately responsible for making sure that the real carrier is paid. So this leads to something called double pay liability. So with the shipper and the broker now stuck with what's called double pay liability, they have to then settle with the real carrier, sometimes having to pay twice for the load. That is why you have a lot of brokers today utilizing multiple screening platforms out there. We've all heard of Highway, RMIS, My Carrier Portal, Carrier 411. All of these platforms exist to help brokers screen carriers better to make sure that a broker is not giving a load to a scammer. And these systems are not infallible. So it's very important that brokers pay attention to what they're doing, because if the broker is going to protect their relationship with their customer, they will indemnify their customer in these too good to be true scams and will be obligated to pay the real carrier for the work that they did. Keep in mind, real carriers, if you are stuck in this situation and you are pursuing the real broker for payment, if you were promised $1 million to move one pallet 1 mile, you cannot reasonably expect that freight broker to pay you that $1 million when he was only paying $200. The lesson there is that the carrier is only entitled at most to the amount of money that the real broker promised to pay who they thought was the carrier. Very important. Now, the shipper and or broker and the real carrier all suffer economic damage here. Again, carrier, you're going to be getting significantly less than you thought the load paid, and you're going to feel put out for it. But the shipper or the broker, they're paying twice for the same load. You are both victims in this scenario. Here's where it gets real dangerous: impersonation. Since regulators and good dispatchers, good carriers, good brokers have been able to identify the scammers utilizing real authorities to execute these scammers have now started to resort to impersonating real carriers and real brokers in order to continue to pull off these scams. In some cases, we have actually seen scammers impersonating shippers. You want to talk about dangerous. Let's get into the carrier side first. So when a carrier is impersonated, you're looking at a scammer stealing the legitimate carrier identity to execute a double broker scam or cargo theft or whatever it is. And it all starts with the scammer getting a load from a real broker. So remember, these guys have the ability to either steal a carrier's authority by getting their DOT PIN number, or through some other scam, they have obtained the carrier's legitimate documentation. So once they have that, now they can start booking loads on that carrier's behalf. So the impacts include the fact that the impersonated carrier doesn't usually know until it is too late. Again, it's all after the fact for the guy who really owns that MC. Another important impact is that the scammer is usually paid in full, usually by quick pay. And if a broker is really paying attention, they will notice that when they ask for quick pay, it's going to go to a different account versus any other past record they have with that carrier. That should be an immediate red flag. Should be. Some brokers don't pay attention to that. Some other impacts: the real carrier, again, unpaid. The real broker then is in jeopardy of double pay liability yet again. In a carrier impersonation situation, the carrier's sitting there like, what the hell just happened? We have no idea what this load is. We don't know what the heck you're talking about, Mr. Broker. And Mr. Broker's sitting there saying, hey, why did you not show up for the cargo? Why did somebody else show up? There's all sorts of arguments that are generated over the impersonation issue. And what makes this so important is reputation management. Often the remedy for a broker dealing with a double broker situation will utilize a freight guard or some other kind of negative review platform in order to identify the booking carrier as a scammer. Well, if the carrier is being impersonated, then the booking carrier is an innocent victim. And that's something that's very important for both carriers and brokers to understand. Again, the booking MC in an impersonation effort is a victim, usually not a perpetrator. We have seen rare instances where they were in league with the scammers, but not often at all. In fact, that is the exception to the rule. Again, the impersonated carrier will face freight guards, fines, and even possible revocation of their authority if it goes high enough to FMCSA. Frankly, most brokers don't even bother with reporting these to FMCSA. They just go straight to a freight guard. And frankly, that is the wrong way. MAP 21 requires brokers to inform FMCSA of double brokering attempts so that FMCSA can investigate. Just filing a freight guard doesn't meet the statutory requirements, brokers. Carrier also then needs to attempt to restore control of their authority. In a future segment, we will talk about how carriers and brokers can restore their authorities in these types of situations. Let's talk about a broker being impersonated, because that happens too. In a broker impersonation attempt, the scammer steals the legitimate broker's identity to execute double brokering scams or cargo theft. And again, it starts with getting a load from a real broker. The real broker has no idea any of this is going on. And frankly, the impersonated broker is not going to know any of this is going on. So what's going to happen, and what we see most often today, is a scammer has stolen a broker's credentials for DAT or truck stop or whatever, logs in as the broker they are impersonating, and then publishes all manner of loads that they have access to, and then books those loads, usually at a very high rate, with carriers, unsuspecting carriers. So again, the impersonated broker never even knows this is happening until you have carriers calling that broker trying to verify the load, or carriers who hauled a load under that broker's faked documents try to collect payment from that broker. So it's usually a few days after the incident took place that the broker finally realizes they've been had. The scammer, again, is paid by QuickPay with the real broker, and they laugh their way all the way to the bank because no one can trace them beyond that. The real carrier remains unpaid. The real broker, again, in jeopardy of double pay liability. You notice the common thread that flows through all of this. The impersonated broker then faces usually internal investigations and different kinds of processes to remove the scammer's access. That could be from the broker having every user within their organization change their DAT passwords or what have you. But there's a lot of damage done. Now, brokers, if you're in this situation and somebody has impersonated you, remember there are two phases to this scam. One, denial of service. Every carrier who's booking those loads will call you and try to verify. At least the smart ones will. After all of that, because that will tie up your phone lines and your emails for the entire day. A couple of days later, your AP departments will be flooded with invoices. absolutely flooded. And if that happens, reach out to us. We can help you in that situation. What we have seen in rare instances is a shipper being impersonated. Now, this is when a scammer acts as a shipper and hires a legitimate broker in order to procure a carrier or transportation for supposed goods and services. Here's where this particular scam gets really creepy. You have a scammer who then tries to cultivate a personal relationship with a new broker. They will act like they're from a mid-sized retailer or a mid-sized shipper of some kind that frankly could be a big name and a big get for a new agent or a new broker. So a new broker is going to be really excited. Hey, cool! I just landed myself a new client, and we've been talking a lot, and they're about to start sending us loads. And the scammer sending the load information for a rate confirmation on a load they just booked as a carrier. So now you have the broker saying, okay, I got to get a load for a 53-foot van, 40,000 pounds, going from X to Y. They get out there on the board, they post a load, they book a carrier, they issue a rate confirmation, carrier hauls the load, and now we're waiting for payment. Well, the carrier is going to get paid pretty quick because they usually factor it or what have you. Well, a new customer for a broker may be operating on a 15 or 30-day term in terms of payment. So if this scammer is hitting this new broker with 2-3 loads a day and doesn't pay anything for the first 30 days, before that broker realizes they're being scammed, that broker may have already paid out hundreds of thousands of dollars to carriers for these loads that the broker is never going to be paid on. The scammer then disappears into the wind and is never heard from again. What makes it even more devious, and we've seen this twice now, is another variant where the scammer is not only pretending to be a shipper, but is also pretending to be a carrier. So the shipper tells their new friend, the real broker, hey, I got this load going out. There's a carrier we like to use, which may be available. Here's their MC number. Can you see if this carrier wants the load? And the broker, oh, hell, they've done the work for me and I'm going to get paid for it. Yay. They go and they call the carrier. They book the carrier. What they don't realize, the carrier is the guy sitting in the desk right next to the scammer who just gave the broker the load. And it's literally a paperwork exercise. There is no real freight. It's all moving around BOLs. The scammer signs off a BOL as a receiver, hands it to his buddy sitting next to him, who's the quote unquote carrier, and they scan it off and send that to the real broker and get paid for it. No real freight moved. And then when the real broker is expecting to get paid, oh, the shipper disappears. These are very, very dangerous. Most brokerages, larger brokerages, do intense background checks on their potential customers. If they are representing a big box store, they're usually contacting their supervisor to ensure that they are dealing with somebody who's authorized to issue loads to brokers. Well, smaller brokers, new brokers, don't have that capability. So if they're not doing that manual legwork, they can get caught up in this scam very quickly and lose an insane amount of money through that particular type of scam. So with that being said, that is the end of part 2. If you have any questions or issues, if you figure out that you are underneath a scam load, you can always contact me, the Double Broker Bounty Hunter, Jay Cantera, vigilanttransport.com. Visit my website, call me on my phone, whatever you need to do, get a hold of some help before the load has to deliver, because that is the only time both carriers and brokers have the ability to prevent a scammer from profiting on the scam. Stay safe out there, and whatever you do, don't let scammers take you for a ride.